Can Ferrari keep championship hope alive, or will the Mexican GP end up revealing the SF25's hidden flaws irreparably? Austin, Texas. That weekend not only was one race run, Ferrari's soul was at stake. After a month of September that bordered on absolute disaster for the Scuderia, the United States Grand Prix became more than just a date on the calendar. It was the border between chaos and hope, the point where the team began to remember how to win, but more importantly, how to compete as a block. Ferrari had arrived at the circuit of the Americas beaten, questioned, and emotionally fractured. That there is still potential. That errors, although serious, are not irreversible. And above all, that Ferrari can still operate at the highest level when all the pieces of the puzzle align, even if it's just for one race. It was, in essence, a breath of oxygen for a team that was beginning to drown in its own sea of unfulfilled expectations. In this context, the Mexican GP is presented as the validation or denial of that redemption. Was Austin a mirage or the beginning of the comeback? Can Ferrari maintain that synergy on a track as particular as the Autodromo Hermanos Rodríguez? The answer remains to be written, but what is undeniable is that, for the first time in weeks, the red Ferrari is once again looking forward. The SF25's operating window is literally a thin line on which Ferrari's 2025 hopes teeter. Any slight deviation, whether in track temperature, taxi height, or crosswind conditions, turns this car into an unpredictable beast. Technically speaking, its sensitivity to height is one of its biggest flaws. In an era where ground effect control is vital, Ferrari has built a car that does not tolerate a single millimeter of error in the suspension. This has forced the team to sacrifice aerodynamic aggressiveness in favor of technical reliability. A brutal example occurred at the Chinese Grand Prix. Hamilton was disqualified for excessive plank wear, and Leclerc's car was declared under the minimum weight. Two different technical errors in the same weekend, both linked to the same origin. An overly ambitious configuration, poorly calibrated for a car that does not forgive. And there comes the second major defect of this car, the thermal management of the brakes. If the car was already fragile on an aerodynamic level, in terms of cooling it has been directly alarming. Singapore was the toughest test. Both drivers, especially Hamilton, suffered severe brake cooling failures, leading to the Briton completely losing braking ability in the final laps. Leclerc also experienced fade, a progressive drop in brake performance that compromised his race pace. Matteo Tognanelli was blunt in his post-race statements. Ferrari miscalculated. They were too aggressive with the setup to seek one-lap performance, and underestimated the real cooling needs for a closed, urban layout. The error was conceptual. And in a team with as much history as Ferrari, that is not tolerable. As if that were not enough, the car also does not respond predictably to tire changes. The transition between medium and soft compounds creates an imbalance in the front axle, forcing drivers to adapt their style lap after lap. This has especially affected Leclerc, whose style requires a lot of confidence in the front end to attack the corner entry. In the SF25, that confidence disintegrates as soon as track conditions deviate from the simulated ideal. It is no coincidence that the Monégasque's best laps in qualifying have come only under ideal conditions and on circuits where the weather did not represent a critical variable. The SF25 is not a slow car, but it is treacherous. It has speed, but only when everything is perfectly aligned. The track, the temperature, the wind, the driver, and the strategy. And that, in a season as volatile as 2025, is a recipe for collapse at any moment. Ferrari has not built a tool for consistent racing, but rather a machine of intermittent performance that threatens to sabotage its own weekends from within. The big question facing Mexico is whether they will be able to keep the SF25 within that narrow band of operational balance. Because if they fail, the punishment at altitude will be relentless. But that is the subject of the next block. The Mexican Grand Prix is not just another race on the calendar. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most demanding technical tests of the entire season. The Autodromo Hermanos Rodríguez, located more than 2,200 meters above sea level, presents atmospheric conditions that no other circuit can replicate. This altitude not only transforms the way cars behave on the track, but it challenges every cooling system, every downforce simulation, every tire pressure calculation. In this scenario, design flaws not only become visible, they are amplified. For Ferrari, this race represents a monumental strategic threat. The SF25 has proven to have a clear Achilles heel: thermal management, especially the brakes. And in Mexico, that problem becomes even more critical. At this altitude, air density drops by 25% compared to circuits at sea level. That lighter air means one thing in engineering terms: less cooling capacity. Radiators run at lower efficiency, brakes heat up faster, and electronic systems operate under constant thermal stress. For a car that has already shown signs of thermal collapse at circuits like Singapore, the Mexican GP could be a minefield. We saw the clearest example of this danger weeks ago. In Marina Bay, Ferrari miscalculated the level of thermal demand of the street circuit, prioritized one-lap speed, and ended up paying with unsustainable brake degradation in the race. In Mexico, the margin of error will be even smaller. The long, demanding braking of the Autodromo, combined with the lack of oxygen, creates an environment where even the most sophisticated systems fail. It's not just a question of performance, it's a question of mechanical survival. But the brakes are not the only problem. The altitude also drastically reduces the downforce generated by the car. The teams, to compensate for this, configure their cars with the highest wing levels of the year, similar to those used in Monaco. However, due to lower atmospheric pressure, those wings simply do not produce the same effect. What you visually see as a high load setting actually generates mid to low level aerodynamic performance. The result is a car that skids, that does not grip, that does not convey confidence to its drivers. This situation forces engineers to resort to alternative solutions, optimizing mechanical grip through the suspension, finding the perfect balance between rigidity and flexibility of the chassis, and ensuring that the tires do not suffer excessive graining. But the SF25 has not been particularly docile in this regard. In fact, one of its constants has been instability in medium traction areas, where the rear axle tends to overheat before expected, compromising the useful life of the compounds. And there is one last critical factor: engine power. At altitude, power units lose efficiency. The turbo compressor must work harder to generate the same pressure as under normal conditions, and this exposes the hybrid system to greater stress. Teams with well-calibrated energy recovery systems can adapt better, but Ferrari has not had a consistent season in that department. Leclerc and Hamilton have reported irregular temperature spikes in multiple practice sessions, suggesting that the engine mapping still needs fine-tuning. In Mexico, any failure of this type can mean loss of power or, worse still, a complete breakdown. The challenge of the Autodromo Hermanos Rodríguez is physical, technical, and strategic. Every corner, every straight, every lap tests a team's ability to master variables that cannot be seen or touched, but that define performance. Ferrari will not only have to deal with its rivals, he will have to fight against his own creation, a car that in extreme conditions is no longer predictable. And right there, on that fine line between recovery and collapse, is where it will be decided whether the SF25 deserves to aspire to something more than surviving in 2025. Because if Mexico once again reveals its shortcomings, the Scuderia could face a winter of doubts long before the calendar ends. Mexico will be much more than a race for Ferrari. It will be the most ruthless mirror where the Scuderia will be able to observe with brutal clarity what it has really built in 2025. Because on this track, everything that has been hidden under the surface, the design errors, the simulation failures, the questionable decisions in the development of the SF25, will be impossible to hide. Here, every miscalculated millimeter and every uncorrected error is paid for with tense that hurt, that humiliate, that can completely ruin a weekend. The Mexican Grand Prix represents a turning point that could change the tone of the rest of the season. If the car responds, if the brakes hold, if the adjusted downforce works despite the thin air, then Ferrari will have taken a key step towards the stability it needs to compete at the top. Not necessarily to win the championship, although that possibility has not yet been completely ruled out, but to establish itself as a solid contender, with the ability to execute under extreme conditions and against unforgiving rivals. But if the car fails, if the SF25 again leaves its pilots adrift, if the engineers fail to adapt the cooling systems and tuning to the unique demands of altitude, then the message will be clear. Austin was an exception. A spark in a system that remains fragile, unbalanced, inconsistent. And in that case, Ferrari's recovery would not only stall, it would go into reverse. Because technical errors in Formula One don't just deduct points. They also erode internal trust. They wear out the pilots. They weaken the cohesion of a team that has already shown this year that it can fracture under pressure. The Scuderia arrives in Mexico with more questions than answers, but also with an opportunity. Because if they manage to win here, if they manage to make the SF25 work where many fail, then they will have sent a signal to the paddock. Ferrari is hurt, yes, but it can still be dangerous. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.